I'm Hannah Whitaker, 33 years old, and the day my grandfather's will was read felt colder than any January in the Rockies. The conference room was warm, but the air in it had edges. Leather chairs whispered when people shifted, and I could hear my own breath as Martin Cole opened a folder thick with signatures. Grant leaned back like a man settling into a throne he'd already measured, while my parents sat poised, our last name gleaming on a brass plaque outside the door. The first words were all about my brother, the Los Angeles estate controlling shares the companies that built towers out of glass and willpower. Then my name came with a pause that scraped, and what followed was a property in the Colorado mountains, a dilapidated house no one had visited in years. Grant's smile didn't move, but his eyes sparkled like champagne. My mother's bracelets clinked once against the table, and my father exhaled the way men do when a bad deal is finally over. Before we go any farther, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand tall when someone dismissed you, tap that like and subscribe so more people can hear stories like this one. I didn't grow up counting money. I grew up counting favors, chores, and the quiet ways people show up for each other. My grandfather Edward was the kind of man who brought home hard hats and blueprints for show and tell, who taught me to press a level against a wall and trust the bubble. My parents valued public polish holiday photos with perfect collars, charity dinners where names were currency, and somewhere between those rooms I learned to keep my head down and do the work that needed doing. After college, I found a niche at a small interior design studio on the east side, the kind with a leaky coffee machine, and clients who paid on time when they could. I liked turning a tired room into a place someone wanted to come home to. My brother grew up in the same house and breathed different air internships arranged before he asked introductions handed across golf carts, praise that arrived early and often. The contrast between us was the kind you don't notice until someone writes it down in ink and calls it an inheritance. In that room, as Martin's voice steadied itself over the final clauses, I could feel the ladder my family had always climbed pull away from where I stood, leaving me on a step that looked flimsy by design. My mother's smile was the kind she used in photographs, narrow and bright, and my father's jaw worked as if he had swallowed a stone. Grant leaned toward me and murmured something about sentimental acreage, and the word sentimental fell like a tack under my heel. I pictured the Colorado place only in colors, pine green, winter white wood, gone gray with weather, and I couldn't tell whether the tightness in my chest was grief or a thread of something braver. When Martin closed the folder and everyone stood, the scrape of chair legs felt like a verdict. My grandfather had built skylines. My brother had inherited them, and I walked out with a ring of keys that didn't shine. Here's what I knew about myself. As I held those keys, I was raised to say thank you, to return what I borrowed, to leave a room better than I found it. I carried a packed lunch, more days than not minded receipts, and stretched a paycheck so rent and decency both got paid. I knew the smell of sawdust and lemon oil, the weight of fabric swatches in a tote bag, and the quiet pride of watching light fall correctly after you move a chair 3 inches to the left. I also knew the language of my parents' disappointment, how it could be spoken without a raised voice, tilted heads, a hand on a sleeve that didn't land a question, asked for the third time. In their world, merit was measured by square footage and last names on donor walls. In mine, value showed up in small places and stayed. When we reached the elevator lobby, my mother finally looked at me, not the way a mother looks at a daughter, but the way a hostess studies a table setting and finds a glass out of line. "We'll discuss next steps at home," she said, and the phrase next steps sounded less like a plan and more like a warning. My father pressed the call button as if the elevator owed him haste, and Grant checked his reflection in the mirrored wall, adjusting a tie he didn't need to fix. I thought about my grandfather's hands, knuckles nicked from job sites long before the boardrooms, and the way he used to say that some foundations hold because someone cared enough to pour them right. The keys were warm in my palm from the heat of my skin, and I realized I'd been squeezing them hard enough to leave marks. I wish I could tell you the drive home softened things, that we laughed about memories and made room for each other's hopes. Instead, the city slid by like a television on mute, and the house I grew up in met us with its wide front steps and symmetrical hedges as proper as a starched collar. My parents walked ahead through the foyer, their footsteps echoing off marble that had always felt colder than it looked. Grant lingered, then passed me with a pat on the shoulder, meant to feel generous. I paused under the chandelier, listening to the house breathe around me, and felt something settle that wasn't resignation. It was steadier than that, like a line drawn with a carpenter's pencil, simple, straight, meant to be followed. Upstairs, a thin envelope lay on my old desk. Property documents, a map, a brief letter from the attorney's office, and the mountain town had a name I hadn't heard since I was a child visiting for a weekend Silver Creek. The paper crackled when I unfolded it, and there was a note in my grandfather's hand at the bottom, just a few words that could have been a blessing or an instruction, depending on how you read them. Outside, a late light burned over the neighborhood and threw long shadows down the street, and I could suddenly smell the resin of pine in a memory that wasn't finished yet. The house was quiet in that particular way that comes before a storm, the kind where you can feel the air tilt. I closed my fingers around the keys and listened to the silence answer back, and I knew the next words spoken in this home would point me toward the road. That night the house felt like a stranger's. The same framed family portraits hung on the hallway walls, polished and perfect, but the warmth inside them had long since faded. My parents' voices drifted from the living room, sharp and low, like the edge of a broken glass. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, suitcase already packed. The keys to the Colorado property were still in my coat pocket, heavy and cold against my hand. When I stepped into the room, my father didn't look up right away. He sat in his usual chair by the fireplace, the flicker of light tracing the lines in his face. My mother stood near the mantel, her arms crossed tightly as though she were bracing against a storm. Grant lounged on the sofa, scrolling his phone, a grin flickering every few seconds, as if none of this touched him. "Sit down, Hannah," my father said finally. His tone was clipped, controlled, the way he used to sound when the contractor called with bad news. I stayed standing. "We need to talk about what happened today." "There's nothing to talk about," I said quietly. Grandpa made his decision. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You're missing the point. Do you understand how this looks? Your brother inherits an empire and you," he gestured vaguely toward my suitcase, "come away with a ruin in the woods. It's humiliating." My mother's bracelets chimed softly as she folded her arms tighter. "Your grandfather was a brilliant man, but in his later years he made some questionable choices. This must have been one of them." Grant laughed under his breath. "Maybe he thought you'd enjoy camping." I ignored him, but my father's voice rose, cutting through. "You think this is funny? Do you realize what people will say? They'll think you were left out because you couldn't handle responsibility." My chest tightened. I didn't ask for anything, I said. He left me what he thought I could handle. Maybe there's a reason for it. My mother shook her head slowly. "A reason. The only reason is pity, Hannah. He must have felt sorry for you." The words hit harder than I wanted to admit. Grant set his phone down and smirked. "Face it, you've always been the soft one. Maybe Grandpa figured a little fixer-upper would keep you busy while the grown-ups run the company." "Enough," I snapped before I could stop myself. "You don't know anything about me, Grant." He raised an eyebrow, amused. "I know you've never finished anything you've started." My father stood his shadow stretching across the room. "That's enough," he said, though his voice didn't sound protective. It sounded tired. "You're not helping, son." But he's right about one thing, Hannah. You've been drifting for years. Small jobs, small ideas. Your brother builds things. You decorate them. I felt my stomach twist. "I build things too," I said quietly. "Just not the kind you notice." My mother sighed, the sound of finality. "You need to stop romanticizing failure. Life isn't about finding yourself in ruins. It's about proving you can climb out of them. Your father and I can't keep watching you waste time." "Waste time." My voice broke. "I've worked since I was 19. I've paid for everything I own. I've never asked either of you for a dime." "That's not the point," my father said sharply. "You don't build legacy with paychecks. You build it with success, and you haven't shown that yet." The silence that followed was suffocating. The fire popped once, and I could smell the smoke curling in the air. Then, without looking at me, he said the words that would carry me out of that house. "You're on your own now, Hannah. Don't come back until you have something to show for yourself." I stared at him, waiting for the crack in his voice, some sign that he didn't mean it. But there was nothing. Grant whistled softly. "Guess you better get used to mountain life." My mother's voice was cool and precise. "Pack what you need. You can drive out tomorrow. Maybe time alone will teach you what real effort looks like." I didn't argue. I went upstairs, closed the door to my childhood room, and sat on the edge of the bed. The walls were still pale yellow, the same color they'd been since high school. A framed photo of me and Grandpa Edward sat on the dresser, taken years ago at a construction site he was proud of. We both wore hard hats, too big for our heads, and his arm was slung around my shoulders. He'd written on the back of that picture in blue ink, "Find what's worth keeping." The next morning the house was quiet when I left. My mother didn't come down. My father didn't say goodbye. Grant leaned in the doorway as I carried my bag out. "You'll be back in a week," he said, smirking. "That place doesn't even have heat." I didn't answer. The keys clinked in my hand as I stepped outside. The air smelled faintly of the ocean and car exhaust. It didn't feel like home anymore. The drive to Colorado stretched long and lonely. My old sedan groaned on the highway, and the farther I drove, the fewer lights I saw. By nightfall, city streets gave way to empty roads lined with pine trees that looked silver in the headlights. The air grew colder as the elevation climbed, and the hum of the tires became the only sound in the world. I stopped once for gas at a station with a flickering sign and a tired cashier who looked like he'd been waiting for morning his whole life. By the time dawn crept over the mountains, my hands ached from gripping the steering wheel. I turned off onto a gravel road marked Silver Creek, the name my grandfather had written in his letter. The road wound through thick forest, twisting so sharply I had to slow to a crawl. Snow from the night before glittered on the branches, and for the first time since leaving Los Angeles, I felt something loosen in my chest, a strange calm that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with space. The house appeared at the end of the road, half hidden behind tall pines. It leaned slightly to one side, its roof sagging under the weight of years. The paint had peeled to gray, and one shutter dangled loose in the wind. The mailbox was rusted, the name, Whitaker, barely visible through the flakes of old paint. When I stepped out of the car, the cold sliced through my coat. My boots crunched in the snow as I walked up to the porch. The boards creaked under my weight, and for a second, I wondered if the whole thing would give way. The key fought the lock before finally turning, and the door swung open with a long, tired groan. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of cedar. A broken table leaned against the far wall, and a stone fireplace sat dark and cold. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof, cutting sharp lines across the floor. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I stood in the doorway, breathing it in, trying to see what my grandfather had seen here. Upstairs, one of the bedrooms still had an old quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. I traced the worn stitching and found a single embroidered initial, E.W. his. There were boxes in the corner, their labels faded, and a trunk that looked too heavy to move. I opened one window just enough to let the mountain air in. It smelled of pine and frozen earth, and it filled the room like a memory. That night, I sat on the floor by the fireplace with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The only light came from a single lamp I'd found in one of the boxes. Outside, wind scraped the corners of the house, and the pines moaned like distant voices. I didn't feel afraid, not exactly, just aware of the silence of the space of how far I'd come. The house was broken, but it wasn't empty. It waited quiet and patient, as if it had been holding its breath for years. I stared into the dark, tracing the grain of the wooden floor with my fingers, and thought about my grandfather's note, "Find what's worth keeping." Somewhere deep inside these walls, I felt there was something worth finding. And though I didn't yet know what that was, I could sense it waiting for me. The wind outside rose again, shaking the windows like a warning or an invitation, I couldn't tell which. I closed my eyes and listened until the sound faded into a whisper, not realizing that this night, the first in my grandfather's forgotten house, was only the beginning of what he meant for me to discover. The first few mornings in Silver Creek passed in near silence. The house creaked like it was breathing, the wood shifting with each sunrise. I woke early, wrapped in the same blanket I'd slept under the night before, and moved from room to room just trying to understand what I'd inherited. Each corner held a trace of what used to be a chipped teacup, a warped picture frame a few pages from a newspaper that must have blown in through the cracked window. The cold found every seam of the house sliding through the walls and crawling under the floorboards. I learned quickly that the small fireplace was the only thing standing between me and the mountain chill. I gathered fallen branches from the edge of the property and stacked them by the hearth. The first time I lit a fire, it filled the room with the scent of pine and smoke. It didn't last long, but it was enough to push back the quiet. Each day followed the same slow rhythm. I cleaned until my hands ached, swept away dust thick enough to leave trails, and opened the windows to let in fresh air. Sunlight fell in soft lines across the worn floorboards, catching the pattern of old footprints where someone, maybe my grandfather, had once walked the same path. I found his handwriting on the back of a half-finished blueprint in the study, the letters precise and steady. It was just a measurement and a note about repairs, but seeing his penmanship made the distance between us feel smaller. At night, the wind pressed hard against the house, whistling through cracks like it was trying to speak. I couldn't tell if it made me uneasy or comforted me. The silence outside the walls was complete, the kind that doesn't exist in cities. It wrapped around everything and left only the sound of my own heartbeat and the steady pop of burning wood. I caught myself listening for voices that weren't there, as if memory itself might step out of the shadows. A few days in, I decided to explore the back of the house. There was a narrow hallway lined with faded wallpaper that peeled at the corners. The last door on the right didn't match the others. It was thicker, darker, carved with symbols I didn't recognize. I tried the keys on my ring one by one, but none of them worked. The handle refused to turn. When I pressed my ear to the wood, the air on the other side felt different, cooler somehow. I almost walked away, but something about that door stayed with me. Later that night, when I couldn't sleep, I went back with a flashlight. The beam slid across the carvings, eagles, suns, twisting lines that met in the center. My grandfather's initials were faintly burned into the lower corner. I ran my fingers over them and felt a spark of curiosity replace the fatigue that had been sitting in my chest for days. I crouched down and noticed a loose panel near the bottom of the wall. The wood there didn't match the rest, it looked newer. I pried it open with the edge of a screwdriver and found a narrow crawl space just wide enough for me to fit through. The smell that came from it was old, dry, and familiar, like cedar left to age. My flashlight caught a sliver of metal inside. I hesitated only a moment before sliding through. The small room on the other side felt untouched. Dust hung in the air, glittering under the light. Shelves lined the walls, each filled with objects wrapped in cloth or paper. There were carved wooden boxes, bundles of old documents, and on one shelf a feathered headdress so white it seemed untouched by time. My hands trembled as I lifted the corner of the fabric covering it, revealing intricate beadwork that gleamed faintly in the light. In the far corner stood a chest made of dark wood, the lid carved with the shape of a wolf howling toward the moon. It was heavier than it looked, the hinges stiff with age. I pushed it open and found a stack of journals tied with leather cords. The top one had my name written across the front, in handwriting that was instantly familiar, my grandfather's. The ink had faded, but the strokes were unmistakable. My breath caught as I opened the first page. To my granddaughter Hannah Whitaker it began, "If you're reading this, it means you found what others could not." I read the words twice before I could go on. He wrote about the house, about how it was more than land or lumber. It was the root of what our family once stood for. He warned that greed had already begun to eat away at the legacy he built, and that only someone who saw beyond profit could protect what mattered most. The pages smelled faintly of tobacco and cedar. He described the artifacts and how they connected to the first builders of Silver Creek, the people who had shared the land long before our family came to it. "These things belong to this place," he wrote. "Guard them. Learn their story. They are not to be sold or buried in vaults." By the time I reached the last line, my hands had stopped shaking. "You were never the lesser one," Hannah, the final sentence read. "You were the one who would listen." I sat there on the cold floor, the beam of my flashlight trembling over the ink, feeling the distance between the man I loved and the family who had cast me aside. The house felt different after that. When I stepped back into the hallway, the air didn't seem so heavy. I cleaned the hidden room carefully the next morning, setting the chest back in its corner and sealing the panel again when I was done. Every few hours, I'd catch myself glancing at that door as I passed by, knowing what waited behind it. The next few nights, sleep came easily for the first time since I'd arrived. I kept the journal by my bed, reading pieces of it whenever the fire burned low. Each page revealed more of who my grandfather really was, what he valued, what he feared, and why he had chosen me instead of Grant. It wasn't about inheritance or punishment. It was about trust. But peace never lasts long in my family. On the fifth morning, the crunch of tires on gravel broke the quiet. I looked through the cracked window and saw a black SUV pull up near the gate. My heart sank when the driver's door opened and Grant stepped out. He was dressed like he'd just come from a board meeting, his jacket sharp against the snow. "So this is it," he said, walking up to the porch. His tone was easy, but his eyes were calculating. The grand prize. I stood in the doorway, the journal hidden behind me. "What are you doing here?" He smirked. "Heard a rumor. People in town talk, you know. Something about a hidden collection of artifacts. Old documents may be worth something. Thought I'd see for myself." "There's nothing here for you," I said. He stepped inside without asking. The floorboards groaned under his shoes. "Come on, Hannah, don't be naive. Grandpa didn't mean for you to sit on anything valuable. You wouldn't even know what to do with it." "I'm not selling anything," I said firmly. He turned his smile thin. "You really think this house, this junk, is going to make you something? It's charity, Hannah. Always has been." I felt the words hit, but I didn't flinch. "It's mine," I said. "And you don't get to take it." His expression hardened. "You'll regret this. You've never won a fight against me, and you won't start now." He left with a slam of the door, the echo carrying through the empty rooms long after his car had disappeared down the road. I stood there for a long time, my hand still on the doorknob, until the last trace of his engine faded into silence. That night, the wind rose again. The walls shook slightly, and snow brushed against the windows like fingertips. I pulled the blanket around my shoulders and stared into the fire, the journal open on my knees. The words on the page blurred as the flames shifted, and I thought about the warning my grandfather had written about greed and what it could destroy. Outside, the cold pressed closer to the glass. Inside, I kept reading, my voice barely above a whisper, as I promised the empty room, "I won't let you down, Grandpa." What I didn't know then was that this promise would be tested sooner than I could imagine, and that the next knock on my door would come from the people I least expected to see again. The snow had barely melted from the front steps when the next car came. It wasn't Grant this time. The tires crunched along the gravel road, and the sound made my chest tighten before I even saw who it was. I stood on the porch, half hoping it was a delivery or someone from town. But when the black sedan stopped at the gate, I recognized the shape of my mother's fur-trimmed coat. My father climbed out after her, his jaw set, his hands already in his pockets, like he couldn't wait to leave. I stayed still until they reached the porch. My mother didn't waste a second on small talk. "We need to talk," she said. The cold turned her breath into small clouds that faded fast. About what I asked, though, I already knew. "Your brother came to us," my father said, his voice heavy with restrained anger. "He told us what's going on here. The house, the items inside, whatever you found." I crossed my arms. "He's exaggerating. There's nothing here that belongs to him." "That's not for you to decide," my mother snapped. "You don't understand the value of what you're sitting on. Lucas said there were documents, maybe artifacts, things worth millions if handled correctly." I told him I'm not selling anything, I said. This was Grandpa's. He trusted me to take care of it. My father shook his head slowly. "You're out of your depth, Hannah. You've never managed real assets. This isn't a hobby you can play with until you get bored. Those items could be legally disputed, and you'd have no idea how to protect yourself." I stepped closer to the railing, gripping it hard to keep my voice steady. "You mean you'd rather Grant control it?" Eileen's expression hardened. "Grant has the experience. You've spent your life avoiding responsibility, and now you want to act like you're capable of handling a legacy? Be reasonable." Her words struck like small, precise stones. "Maybe Grandpa didn't trust experience," I said quietly. "Maybe he trusted something else." She laughed softly but without warmth. "Trust your grandfather made mistakes, Hannah. He was sentimental, especially about you. That's why he left you this burden instead of something useful." A gust of wind pushed across the porch, scattering dry pine needles at our feet. My father's voice was calm, but the edge was unmistakable. "You're making a mess of this. The press will hear about the inheritance soon enough, and if this turns into a legal dispute, our family name will be dragged through the mud. Is that what you want?" I stared at him. "You're worried about reputation. I'm worried about keeping a promise." He stepped closer, his shadow cutting across mine. "Promises don't pay for lawyers, Hannah. They don't protect property rights. You think this is noble, but it's reckless." Something in me cracked then, not loudly, but cleanly. "You've been calling me reckless my whole life," I said, my voice low. "But I'm the only one doing exactly what Grandpa asked. You just can't stand that he didn't pick you or Grant to finish what he started." My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "You sound ungrateful." "Maybe," I said, "but I'm not giving you the journal, or the keys, or anything else he left me." The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend the air. My father's eyes were cold. "You'll ruin everything," he said finally. "Mark my words. Then at least it'll be something I chose," I answered. He turned without another word, and my mother followed her heels, clicking sharply against the wood. She didn't look back when she said, "You'll regret this, Hannah. Pride always ends the same way." Their car disappeared down the road, leaving only tire tracks and the echo of their voices behind. I stood on the porch long after they were gone, the wind tugging at my hair, the cold biting at my hands. For the first time in years, I wasn't angry, just empty. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers. I added another log and sat close to the warmth, staring at the flames until they blurred. The journal lay open beside me, the ink catching the light. My grandfather's words were steady and patient, written decades before this moment, but they felt like they were meant for now. Protect what matters, even from those who can't see it yet. Days passed after their visit. The house felt different again, still quiet, but not lonely anymore. I worked from sunrise to sunset repairing what I could. I patched the roof where the snow had melted through, scrubbed the floors until the boards gleamed, and fixed the broken window that had been letting the cold slip in. Each task grounded me. I found a rhythm in the work, in the creak of the hammer and the smell of wood dust. The townspeople started noticing. A man named Carl from the hardware store stopped by one afternoon with a spare set of nails and a thermos of coffee. "Didn't think anyone would ever take this place on," he said, nodding toward the house. "It's been a while," I said. "Your grandfather used to bring me sketches for repairs, said one day it'd be someone else's turn." He smiled faintly. "Guess that's you." After he left, I stood in the yard a long while, the cold air stinging my cheeks. It felt strange to be seen as part of this town, as something other than the daughter who disappointed everyone. By evening, the quiet returned. I made soup on the old stove and read by the fire, the journal open on my lap. I traced my grandfather's handwriting with my fingertips and wondered how much he'd known about what would happen between me and the rest of the family. Maybe he'd known exactly. Maybe that was the point. The next morning brought the first letter. It was slipped under the door, no return address. The paper was crisp and heavy, the kind lawyers use. My name was written across the front in neat block letters. Inside, the words were simple but sharp enough to cut "Notice of intent to file. Property claim." For a long time I couldn't move. The letter blurred in my hands. Grant's name appeared at the bottom, his signature printed in dark ink. He was claiming the house and everything in it, alleging that our grandfather had been confused when he wrote the will, that it had been meant for him all along. I sat at the kitchen table, the letter spread flat in front of me, and listened to the sound of the wind rising outside. It rattled the windows and sighed through the cracks in the door. For a moment I almost let fear take over. Then I looked again at the journal lying nearby. If you are reading this, it means I trusted you to find what others could not. The words steadied me. I reached for my phone, opened my contacts, and scrolled to a name I hadn't used in years. Avery Knox. We'd met in college when I worked part-time in the campus office. She'd gone on to become an attorney in Denver. When she answered, her voice was the same direct calm, the kind that always got people to listen. "Avery, it's Hannah Whitaker," I said. "I think I need your help." By the time we hung up, she'd promised to take the case. She wanted copies of the deeds, the will, and the journal pages I'd found. "We'll fight this," she said, but it won't be quick. That night, I packed the documents carefully in a folder and placed them by the door. The fire burned low and the shadows on the walls shifted as the light flickered. I could feel the weight of what was coming, the fight, the scrutiny, the doubt. But I also felt something else quiet and solid under it all. Determination. Outside snow began to fall again, soft and steady. I watched it cover the tire tracks my parents had left behind, erasing them one flake at a time, until there was only white stretching toward the trees. I took a deep breath and whispered to the dark window pane, "I won't let them take it from me." The words hung in the cold air, small, but certain as the fire crackled beside me. Somewhere beyond the trees, a wolf's howl echoed faintly through the mountains, low, distant, but strong enough to carry. And as the sound faded, I knew the next time I'd see my brother, it wouldn't be on this porch. It would be in a courtroom. The morning after I spoke with Avery, the light over Silver Creek came thin and pale, washing the trees in silver. The air had that brittle quiet that comes before a storm. I stood by the kitchen window, the folded letter from Grant still sitting on the table beside the coffee mug I hadn't touched. It didn't seem real that my brother was suing me not over money, but over what our grandfather had left in trust. Still, the papers said what they said. By noon, Avery called. "We'll file our response this week," she told me. "Don't talk to him directly. Everything goes through me from now on." Her voice was steady, the kind that made chaos sound manageable. "I'll drive up in 2 days to go over the documents with you." When she arrived, the snow had turned to slush along the gravel road. Avery stepped out of her car in boots that looked too clean for mountain mud, but she handled it like she'd done it before. She shook my hand, her expression all business. "You've got a good case," she said as we walked toward the house. "But your brother's lawyer is aggressive. He'll try to make you look unfit to manage the property." "I've been called worse," I said quietly, pushing open the front door. We spread everything out on the dining table, the will, the deed, the journal. Avery read for a long time without speaking. The only sound was the soft rustle of pages and the occasional creak from the old beams overhead. Finally, she looked up. "This journal is everything. It's personal detailed, and he names you directly. The handwriting's verified in the will file. That's powerful." She pointed to one line written in my grandfather's steady script. "To my granddaughter, Hannah Whitaker, I entrust the Cold Creek property and all within it. It is hers to protect, not to sell." Avery nodded. "That's intention. It's not just a gift, it's a directive." For the first time in days, I felt my shoulders unclench. "So we can win this." "We can fight," she said, and I caught the faintest smile. That's what matters right now. The hearing was scheduled 3 weeks later in Denver. The days leading up to it passed in fragments, phone calls, document scans, long drives to town for copies and notarizations. Each evening I came home to the same quiet, the same creaking floorboards, and the same view of snow settling along the roof. The house had become more than shelter. It felt like the one place in the world that still believed in me. When the hearing day came, I woke before sunrise. The mountain air was sharp, the kind that stings your lungs but clears your head. I wore the only black dress I owned, simple and pressed, and tied my hair back. Avery picked me up at 7. The drive down the mountain was long, the roads slick with frost. Neither of us talked much. The courthouse in Denver loomed gray and polished its steps crowded with strangers. Inside, the air buzzed with the low hum of voices and the echo of heels on tile. Grant was already there, standing near our parents. He looked like a photograph-tailored suit, perfect posture, not a hair out of place. My mother's eyes met mine for a brief second, but she looked away before I could speak. When our names were called, we stepped into the courtroom. Judge Ruth Delgado sat at the bench, her gaze direct but not unkind. She reviewed the file, her glasses low on her nose. The air felt heavy, like the moment before thunder. Grant's lawyer spoke first. His tone was smooth, practiced. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that the decedent, Mr. Edward Whitaker, was in declining mental health at the time he amended his will. The decision to assign the Cold Creek property to my client's sister was made without full awareness of its value and significance. We believe the intent was for Mr. Grant Whitaker to inherit all Whitaker assets, including the Colorado property, and any items of potential historical or financial worth found within it. Each word felt rehearsed, detached like it had been written for a play. When he sat down, Grant smirked faintly across the aisle, as if the outcome was already certain. Avery stood next. Her voice carried through the room, firm and even. "Your Honor, my client's grandfather, Edward Whitaker, was neither confused nor manipulated. He made a deliberate choice documented in his own handwriting and verified by witnesses. The property in Cold Creek was entrusted to Hannah Whitaker not as a casual gift, but as a stewardship of legacy. The journal we've submitted contains his explicit instructions and affirms his confidence in her character." Judge Delgado leaned back, folding her hands. "Ms. Whitaker," she said, "are you prepared to testify?" My pulse thudded in my ears. "Yes, Your Honor." When I took the stand, the room felt smaller, every sound sharper. The clerk swore me in, and Avery began. "Hannah, can you tell the court what the property means to you?" I looked down at my hands, then at the journal sitting on the evidence table. "It's not just land," I said softly. "It's history. My grandfather built his life from nothing, and this house, this place was where he started. He left it to me because he wanted it protected. He wrote it himself." Avery nodded. "And how do you know that?" "Because he told me in this," I said, pointing to the journal. "He said if I was reading it, it meant he trusted me to find what others couldn't. He didn't want this legacy sold off or forgotten. He wanted it cared for." When Avery sat down, Grant's lawyer stood again. "Ms. Whitaker," he said, his voice suddenly sharper, "do you have any experience managing property or historical assets?" "No," I said. "Do you have formal education in preservation or real estate?" "No." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "So you admit you're unqualified to handle this estate. Isn't it true your brother has extensive experience managing the family's business holdings?" I met his eyes. "Maybe. But my grandfather didn't choose him for this." The lawyer's lips tightened. "You've been unemployed since leaving Los Angeles, correct? I've been restoring the property," I said evenly. "By hand." He smirked slightly. "That's admirable, Ms. Whitaker, but this isn't about sentiment. It's about competence." Before I could speak again, Judge Delgado raised a hand. "That's enough." Her gaze shifted to Grant. "Mr. Whitaker, you may testify." Grant's voice carried that same calm arrogance he'd perfected years ago. "My sister's always been emotional. She means well, but she's impulsive. This property could become part of something larger, a development, a resort. I know how to make it valuable." "She doesn't." Avery stood again. "Mr. Whitaker, is it your belief that value can only be measured in profit?" He hesitated, caught off guard. "I believe in results. So did your grandfather," Avery said quietly. "And the result he wanted is sitting right here defending his legacy while you try to sell it." Grant's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. The courtroom fell still. Judge Delgado took her time before speaking. "I've reviewed the documents, the testimony, and the will. The evidence of intent is clear. The Colorado property, along with its contents, remains in the legal possession of Hannah Whitaker." Her gavel struck once. Case closed. The sound echoed like thunder. My breath caught, and for a second the world went perfectly still. Then Grant's voice broke through, low and sharp. "You'll regret this," he muttered as he brushed past me on his way out. Avery placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did fine," she said. Outside, the air felt lighter. The sky over Denver was a hard blue, the kind that comes after snow. I watched my parents climb into their car without a word. Grant followed, slamming the door hard enough to make the glass shake. Avery handed me the folder with the court seal stamped on top. "Keep this somewhere safe," she said. "You earned it." The drive back up the mountain was quiet. The road curved through the trees, the late sun glowing gold through the branches. When we reached Silver Creek, the house looked smaller against the sky, but steadier somehow. I stood at the gate for a moment, the folder in my hands, and felt a calm I hadn't known in years. Inside, the fire had gone cold. I knelt, added kindling, and watched the flame catch. The orange light flickered across the walls, and for the first time, I understood what my grandfather had meant when he wrote that some things are worth keeping not because they're valuable, but because they're true. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with warmth. Outside, the snow began again, slow and gentle, like the world was starting over. And though I didn't yet know what would come next, I knew one thing for certain: the house, the legacy, and the name he left behind were finally safe. What I didn't know was that peace wouldn't last forever, and that the real work of rebuilding was only just beginning. When I drove back up the mountain after the hearing, the air felt lighter. Every mile closer to Silver Creek pulled the noise of Denver farther behind. The road curved through pines dusted in snow, their branches bending under the weight of the late afternoon sun. By the time I reached the house, the light had softened to gold. It spilled across the porch and touched the window panes that no longer rattled in the wind. I stopped at the gate and took a deep breath. The fight was over. The house and everything inside it was finally mine. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of pine smoke. I lit a fire and set the court folder on the table beside my grandfather's journal. For a long time, I just stood there watching the flames catch the paper edges curling into orange. I didn't feel triumphant, only steady. The kind of peace that comes after you've run out of fear. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The mountains outside the window were covered in a pale blue mist. I boiled water on the stove and sat with my coffee listening to the quiet hum of the house settling. For weeks, I'd lived with the fear that it could all be taken from me. Now there was only silence and the question of what came next. The answer found me sooner than I expected. Around noon, Carl pulled up in his old pickup, a coil of rope in the back, and 2 paper cups of coffee in his hands. "Heard the news," he said, handing me one. "Whole town's been talking. You made old Ed proud." I smiled, the warmth of the cup soaking through my gloves. "I'm just glad it's done." Carl looked past me toward the porch. "Now comes the real work," he said. "This place has good bones, just needs care." Over the next few weeks, that's what I gave it: care. Each day had its rhythm. I patched walls, sanded floors, sealed windows against the mountain wind. Carl came by often, sometimes with tools, sometimes just with company. He'd tell me stories about my grandfather, how he used to walk into town with blueprints rolled under his arm, how he always tipped the diner waitress twice. Every story stitched a piece of Edward Whittaker back into the house. One afternoon, while clearing out the back room, I found an old radio tucked behind a stack of boxes. The casing was scratched, but when I turned the dial, it hummed faintly to life. A soft crackle filled the air, followed by the sound of a piano drifting through the static. I left it playing as I worked the music wrapping around the quiet like a heartbeat. Nights came early that time of year. I'd sit by the fire with the journal open, rereading passages I'd already memorized. My grandfather had written about mistakes, about learning the difference between building something for profit and building something to last. He talked about legacy not as a monument, but as a responsibility. Reading his words felt like standing in the same room with him again. Then one evening near the end of March, a knock came at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, the cold swept in sharp and clean. My mother stood on the porch, her hair pinned neatly under a scarf, a small leather purse clutched in her hands. "Hannah," she said, "can I come in?" I hesitated, then stepped aside. She looked around as she entered, her eyes tracing the walls and the furniture like she was taking inventory. "It's warmer than I thought it would be," she said. "I fixed the insulation," I replied. We stood there for a moment, the silence thick but not hostile. Finally, she set her purse on the table. "I owe you an apology," she said softly. I should have listened instead of taking sides. I didn't answer right away. The fire popped behind us. "You didn't believe me," I said quietly. "You believed him." Her eyes fell to the floor. "Your father thought Grant would carry the family forward." I followed his lead. "But when I saw the papers, the way the judge ruled, it made me realize Edward saw something in you that we didn't." She looked up then. "I'm sorry for that." The words hung in the air, fragile and real. I nodded once, the weight of them settling in. "Grant," I asked. She sighed. "He's angry. He'll stay that way for a while. But I think losing was good for him. Maybe it'll teach him what your grandfather tried to." I poured her tea, the simple gesture bridging a gap that years of pride had built. We talked for hours about the house, about Edward, even about my childhood. When she left, the air inside felt lighter. The ghosts of old words and old wounds seemed to fade a little with her footsteps. In the weeks that followed, small signs of change appeared. A postcard from my father arrived one morning, short, formal, but genuine. "Hope you're well. Heard the ruling was fair. Take care of yourself." I set it beside the journal, not as forgiveness, but as proof that even hard people can soften with time. As spring settled into the valley, the house transformed. The sagging porch held steady under new beams. The roof no longer leaked. I hung sheer curtains in the front windows, and when sunlight poured through them, the room glowed the same amber color as my grandfather's study once had. One afternoon, I decided to open the crawl space again. The air inside was cool and dry. I wiped the dust from the carved chest and opened it carefully. Inside, beneath the old papers, was a small tin box I hadn't noticed before. It held photographs sepia and worn edges curling. My grandfather, as a young man, stood beside workers on a construction site, the Colorado mountains stretching behind them. On the back of one photo, he'd written in small block letters, "Build something that outlives you." I placed the photo on the mantel just above the fire. For the first time, I felt like I was doing exactly that, not through money or ownership, but through care. By early summer, the house had stopped feeling like a burden. Neighbors came by more often sometimes to drop off baked bread, sometimes to share stories about their own families. Carl's wife, Margaret, brought me a pot of wildflowers that bloomed in purple bursts near the steps. Even the mailman started waving each morning as he passed the gate. Life in Silver Creek wasn't what I had imagined for myself, but it fit in ways city life never had. I started sketching designs again, ideas for restoring other cabins nearby, keeping the architecture true to its roots. When I sent the first proposal to the local historical board, Carl grinned and said, "Looks like Ed's spirit rubbed off on you after all." The night I got the approval letter, I sat on the porch under a clear sky. The stars stretched wide and bright above the ridge, the same view my grandfather must have known. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf called again, low and sure. I closed my eyes, listening to it echo through the trees, and felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally found her place. But life has a way of testing even the strongest piece. A few days later, as I was repainting the kitchen, my phone rang. It was Avery. Her voice carried a tone I hadn't heard since before the trial, measured but tense. "Hannah," she said, "I need to let you know something. Your brother filed an appeal. He's trying again." The paintbrush slipped from my hand, landing with a soft thud on the drop cloth. Outside, the wind rose through the trees, rattling the porch rail. I stared at the wall for a long moment, the sound of my heartbeat filling the space where calm had just been. "I'll handle it," Avery continued. "But it's not over yet." The call ended and the house fell silent again. Only the fire crackled in the next room, steady as breath. I walked to the window and looked out at the mountains, the same ones my grandfather once built, towards steady and unafraid. I whispered into the quiet, "All right, Grandpa. We'll fight again if we have to." The light outside dimmed as clouds rolled in the air, growing cool with the promise of rain. And as the first drops touched the glass, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the turning point before the next climb. The storm broke overnight. When I woke, the windows were fogged, and the air carried the faint smell of rain and ash from the fireplace. For a moment, I hoped the call from Avery had been a dream, but the phone on the table, still showing her missed number, told the truth. Grant had filed an appeal. Outside, the mountains looked bruised, their peaks hidden under low clouds. I wrapped a scarf around my shoulders and stepped onto the porch. The boards were slick with rain, and the fields below shimmered under a dull gray light. The quiet after a storm always felt fragile, like the world was deciding whether to rest or fight again. By noon, Avery's car pulled into the drive. She didn't waste time with greetings. "We have to respond within 10 days, she said, spreading a file across the table. "He's challenging the ruling, claiming new evidence letters suggesting your grandfather was coerced." I stared at her. "Letters." "What letters?" "They're forgeries," she said firmly. "But we'll have to prove that." She pointed to the court schedule. "The hearing's been fast-tracked. You're back in Denver next week." I nodded slowly. Then we fight again. The next few days blurred together in a mix of phone calls, scanned documents, and late nights reading through evidence. Avery worked from Denver while I prepared what I could here. I made copies of the journal, every page, and took photographs of the house, the carvings, the hidden room, anything that might tie the inheritance back to my grandfather's intent. On the fifth evening, I was tightening the latch on a window when I noticed headlights at the end of the drive. My heart sank. It wasn't Avery's sedan or Carl's pickup. The car was too new, too familiar. Grant stepped out, rain glinting off his coat. He walked up the path without hesitation, stopping a few feet from the porch. "We need to talk," he said. "I think we've said everything," I replied. "Not like this." His voice was calm, but there was a strain underneath it. "You won the first round. Fine. But this house is bigger than you think. There's value here you don't understand." I folded my arms. "It's not for sale." He exhaled sharply. "You really think Grandpa left this to you because of some noble reason you were a project to him, Hannah? Something to fix." "That's not true," I said, though the words tasted bitter. He stepped closer. "I've seen the letters. They'll convince the court. Walk away now and I'll make sure you get something out of it. Money a share in the business, anything you want." "I already have what I want," I said quietly. His eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake. You don't have the stomach for this." I met his stare. "You're wrong about that." For a moment we stood in silence, the rain pattering between us. Then he shook his head, turned and walked back to his car. The taillights disappeared down the mountain road, leaving only the hum of the wind behind. That night, I barely slept. I sat by the fire staring at the journal open on my lap. My grandfather's words seemed to rise from the page, "Protect what matters even when it costs you." I whispered the line aloud until the sound steadied my breathing. When the morning came, I packed for Denver. The house felt alive around me, the wood groaning softly as if aware of what was coming. Before leaving, I locked the hidden room and slipped the key into my coat pocket. The courthouse felt colder this time. Avery met me at the steps, her face composed but serious. "His lawyer's bringing those letters as exhibits. They'll try to discredit the journal." We walked inside the marble floors, echoing under our steps. Grant was already seated at the front, with his attorney polished and calm, as if he'd rehearsed every gesture. My parents sat behind him, their expressions tight and unreadable. I didn't look their way. When the session began, Grant's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, the documents we're submitting demonstrate that the decedent was under undue influence when revising his will. These letters," he held up several pages, "show correspondence between Mr. Whitaker and his attorney suggesting he doubted his granddaughter's ability to manage the property." Avery rose immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. These documents are unsigned, undated, and lack verification. We have handwriting samples proving they are forgeries." The judge glanced down at the papers. "Proceed carefully," she warned. As the arguments unfolded, I felt the air in the courtroom thicken. Grant watched me from across the aisle, his gaze steady, his jaw set. When it was my turn to testify, Avery guided me gently. "Ms. Whitaker, can you tell the court what steps you took after inheriting the property? I described the repairs, the preservation work, the efforts to restore the artifacts my grandfather had protected." She asked about the journal, and I handed over the copies. He wrote those entries over 10 years. His handwriting never changed. He left clear instructions. Grant's lawyer stood to cross-examine. "Miss Whitaker, you're not a handwriting expert, are you? No. So you can't personally verify the authenticity of your grandfather's journal." I met his eyes. "No, but I can verify his voice. I knew how he spoke, how he wrote. These words sound like him." The lawyer hesitated, then shifted tactics. "If your brother were willing to preserve the property under family management, would you consider sharing ownership?" "No," I said simply. Even if it meant avoiding another lengthy trial, I took a breath. Legacy isn't something you split for convenience. He frowned but said nothing more. When the judge recessed for deliberation, the room emptied except for a few clerks shuffling papers. I sat in the back row, my hands clasped in my lap. Avery leaned over. "Whatever happens, you handled yourself perfectly." The minutes stretched into nearly an hour. Then Judge Delgado returned. Her tone was calm but firm. "The court finds the new evidence unreliable. The handwriting analysis submitted by the defense fails to meet standards of authenticity. Therefore, the previous ruling stands. The Cold Creek property remains under the rightful ownership of Ms. Hannah Whitaker." A single sound escaped me, half breath, half relief. Across the aisle, Grant's face went pale. My mother covered her mouth with her hand. My father looked down at the table silent. When the gavel fell, the sound echoed like thunder again. Outside, sunlight had broken through the clouds. Avery clasped my shoulder. "It's over," she said. "For good this time." I nodded the words, sinking in slowly. "Thank you." Grant passed us on the courthouse steps without speaking. For a second, our eyes met. There was no anger there anymore, just something hollow, like recognition of a loss he couldn't undo. The drive back to Silver Creek was quiet. The late light turned the trees amber, and the air smelled faintly of wet pine. When I reached the house, the first thing I saw was the photo of my grandfather on the mantel. The edges were still curled, the ink faded, but his smile was clear. I set my bag down and touched the frame lightly. The house was warm again, the fire burning steady. The air felt different, not heavy with waiting, but open, like it could finally breathe. That night, I stood on the porch watching the sky fade into dusk. The valley below shimmered in soft blue light, and for the first time I felt no weight pressing on me. The fight was done. The legacy was safe. Still, as I looked toward the mountains, I couldn't help but think of Grant, of what it must feel like to lose everything you were certain you deserved. Maybe someday he'd understand what our grandfather had tried to teach both of us. The wind moved gently through the pines, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and rain. I turned back toward the door, the glow from the hearth spilling into the yard, and whispered a quiet thank you to the house that had held its ground through every storm. I didn't know it then, but what came next wouldn't be about fighting anymore. It would be about rebuilding one wall, one family, one piece of peace at a time. The days after the final ruling felt quieter than I expected. No calls from lawyers, no letters in the mail, no more waiting for the next move. The fight that had once filled every thought was simply gone, leaving a calm I hadn't known in years. Silver Creek woke each morning under a soft layer of fog, and for the first time I didn't feel the need to look over my shoulder. The house, my grandfather's house, stood steady in the stillness, as if it had been holding its breath until now. I spent that week repairing the last pieces of the place that needed care. The porch railing, the faded shutters, the old mailbox that still leaned slightly to the left. Carl helped when he could, showing up with nails and stories, while Margaret brought jars of homemade preserves and gentle advice about planting wildflowers come spring. When the last board was fixed and the roof no longer leaked, I stood back and looked at it, all the wood, the stone, the light shining through the windows, and it finally felt whole again. One evening I drove into town for supplies. At the hardware store, a familiar voice stopped me by the aisle of paint samples. It was my father. He looked smaller than I remembered, though his posture was the same, upright, contained but softer somehow. "Your mother wanted to come," he said, "but she thought you'd rather see me first." He paused, glancing toward the door. I read the court decision. It was right. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was an old photograph of me sitting on my grandfather's knee, both of us laughing, my face covered in smudged dirt. "He carried that in his wallet," my father said quietly. "Guess I didn't realize how much he saw in you." I held the photo carefully. "He saw what you taught me to hide," I said. "He saw that being steady isn't the same as being weak." My father nodded once his eyes wet around the edges. "You proved that," he said. We stood there for a long moment, neither of us trying to fill the silence. When he left, he gave my shoulder a brief squeeze, a gesture that said more than words ever could. That night, the mountains glowed under a full moon. I built a fire, poured a cup of tea, and opened my grandfather's journal one last time. The final entry was short, written in his careful hand. "Legacy is what you build quietly without applause. It lives where care outlasts pride." I closed the book, set it on the mantel beside the photograph, and let the warmth of the flames wash over me. The months that followed unfolded gently. I began taking small projects, restoring other old cabins in the valley. People in town started calling me Ed's granddaughter, not the way they used to with pity, but with respect. Grant didn't reach out, and I didn't chase him. Through a mutual friend, I heard he'd sold his city condo and started working abroad. Maybe distance would teach him what this place had taught me, that success built on power alone never lasts. By summer, the wildflowers Margaret had planted bloomed in every color across the yard. Children from town would ride their bikes past the gate calling out greetings. Sometimes I'd hear Carl's laughter drifting up from the road, and I'd wave from the porch where my grandfather once stood. Life had come back to the house in quiet, ordinary ways. One afternoon, as the sun dropped low behind the ridge, I stood outside and looked over the land. The light caught on the newly painted shutters, the window glass reflecting the orange of the sky. I realized this place had stopped being a symbol of inheritance or justice. It had become a home, not because of the victory in court, but because of the work, the patience, the steady hands that rebuilt what had been broken. My grandfather's words had finally settled into truth. Legacy isn't measured in what's left behind. It's measured in what we choose to keep alive. It's the roof we mend, the letter we forgive, the peace we protect, even when no one's watching. As dusk deepened, I lit the lantern on the porch and let its glow spill into the yard. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and new grass. For the first time, I felt completely at ease, not because everything was perfect, but because I finally knew my place within it. So that's where I leave this story, on a quiet mountain, in a house once forgotten, now full of light again. And if you've ever fought to protect something no one else believed in, I hope you find your own version of this peace. Take a moment wherever you are to think about what's worth keeping in your life, the things that outlast pride, noise, and time. And if this story reminded you of your own strength, share it with someone who might need that reminder too.